Forget stocks, forget crypto, forget every financial crash you've ever read about. The world's first great financial bubble wasn't built on mortgages or tech companies or even gold. It was built on a flower. A single bulb, not even bloomed yet, still buried in frozen Dutch soil, sold for more than the finest canal mansion in Amsterdam. A sailor was thrown in prison for eating one for lunch, mistaking it for an onion. Ordinary weavers, bakers, and carpenters handed over their entire life savings for a plant they had never seen, trading nothing but promises and thin air. This wasn't a backroom scam. This wasn't a few desperate gamblers losing their shirts. This was Holland in 1637, the wealthiest, most sophisticated economy on the planet. The country that invented the modern stock market. The country that built the first multinational corporation in history. And they lost their minds over a tulip. The strange thing is, the story you've heard, the one where an entire nation collapsed, where fortunes vanished overnight, where the whole economy was brought to its knees, almost none of it is true. So what actually happened? How did a flower, a biologically dying, virus-infected flower, become the most desired asset in the world? How did it create the blueprint for every market crash that followed? And why did the people who wrote history get it so spectacularly wrong? This is Tulip Mania. To understand why this happened, you first need to understand where it happened. Because the Netherlands in the early 1600s was not your average European country. The Dutch Republic was, by almost any measure, the most advanced economy on the planet. Highest income per capita in the world. They had just invented the modern stock exchange. They had the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, which was essentially the first multinational corporation in history, pulling in insane amounts of wealth from trade routes around the globe. So you have this relatively small country, geographically speaking, absolutely flooded with new money. And here's where it gets interesting. A lot of these newly wealthy merchants were Calvinist, strict Protestants, which meant showing off your money in vulgar, ostentatious ways was frowned upon. You couldn't just go buy a gold throne and call it a day. So what do you do when you're rich, but you need to look tasteful about it? You buy a garden. You fill it with rare, exotic plants imported from the far corners of the world. You become a connoisseur. And the most exotic, most coveted plant of all, the one that had just arrived from the Ottoman Empire via Vienna, was the tulip. The tulip had been beloved in the Turkish court for centuries. When the Holy Roman Emperor's ambassador visited Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in 1554, he watched these flowers blooming in the middle of a harsh winter and basically lost his mind. He shipped bulbs back to Europe immediately. By 1593, a botanist named Carolus Clusius brought his collection to the University of Leiden in the Netherlands and discovered the Dutch climate was actually perfect for growing them. Clusius charged enormous prices for his bulbs, keeping them exclusive. He wanted them only in the hands of serious scholars and fellow collectors, which, predictably, made everyone else furious. So in 1596, and again in 1598, someone broke into Clusius's garden at night and stole his bulbs. And that theft, that petty act of garden robbery, is basically how the Dutch commercial tulip trade was born. So the Dutch are growing tulips. Standard ones. Solid colors. Pretty, sure, but nothing extraordinary. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, something bizarre started happening to some of the bulbs. The flowers would bloom, and instead of being solid red or purple, they'd come out covered in these wild, intricate flames of contrasting color. White petals streaked with crimson, yellow petals feathered with deep purple, like someone had painted them by hand with a very talented brush. The Dutch called these broken tulips, and they were completely obsessed. They organized them into three categories. There were the roses, red or pink on white, the bizarres, brown or purple on yellow, and the B-bloomens, purple on white. Each category had its own champions, its own top specimens, its own bidding wars. Growers gave their prized flowers increasingly dramatic names to match their prices. Military ranks were popular. You'd see names like Admiral van der Eyck or General Gouda. There was one called the Gele Prince, the Yellow Prince, the Purperkroon, the Crown of Purple. And then, alongside all these regal names, you'd have something like the Professor Schotel, Professor Saucer, or the Pottenbacher, which literally just means the potter. Someone looked at their 1,000 guilder flower and thought, yeah, I'll name this one the Saucer. Now, nobody in the 1630s understood why some tulips broke and others didn't. Botany was still tangled up with alchemy and superstition. The transformation felt miraculous, unpredictable, divine even. So growers tried everything to force it. They bound broken bulbs next to unbroken ones, hoping the pattern would transfer. They mixed the soil with pigeon dung, old plaster, dishwater, powdered paint, anything. They were essentially hoping the color would wash into the roots. It never reliably worked. The breaking remained completely random, which, of course, made the broken ones even more valuable. Here's the twist that took scientists nearly 3 centuries to figure out. In 1928, a British botanist named Dorothy Cayley finally identified the cause, a virus. Specifically, a plant virus spread by aphids, tiny insects, that infected the bulb and interfered with how the flower produced its pigment. The virus broke the tulip's color production. In some cells, pigment was completely suppressed, leaving patches of white or yellow. In others, color came through in full. The result was those gorgeous, unpredictable flame patterns. Modern science has actually mapped out the exact mathematical mechanism. The virus creates what's called an activator substrate pattern, the same kind of mathematical process that generates stripes on a zebra or spots on a leopard. The virus moves through the growing petal at different speeds, consuming the cellular resources that produce color. High viral load, white. Low viral load, full color. The result is a natural painting, every single flower different. And here's the devastating irony that nobody in 1637 could possibly have known. The very thing that made these tulips so beautiful was also killing them. The virus weakened the bulb. It stunted growth. It reduced how many offspring the plant could produce. Every generation got a little weaker. The most spectacular flowers were the sickest ones. And over time, every single famous broken tulip from this era went completely extinct. The virus that created them also destroyed them. Today, cultivating virus-infected tulips is heavily restricted or outright illegal in many places to prevent the disease from spreading to healthy crops. The Rembrandt-style tulips you can buy today, with their painted-looking patterns, are carefully bred to look that way without any virus. A handful of original heirloom varieties survive in isolated private collections under license. But the vast majority of the era's famous flowers exist only in historical records and 17th century still life paintings. Gone, because they were too beautiful to survive. By the early 1630s, you've got this perfect storm. A wealthy country with money to spend. A culture that channels that wealth into rare plants. A flower that produces these spontaneous, virus-driven masterpieces that nobody can reliably reproduce on demand. Prices start climbing. And then the Dutch do what the Dutch do. They innovate. They create a futures market. Here's how it worked. Tulips bloom for about 1 week in April or May. After that, the bulb goes dormant underground until the following spring. During those dormant months, basically June through the following April, you couldn't see the bulb, couldn't inspect it, couldn't physically hand it to anyone. but you could sell it anyway. Florists started writing promissory notes, little contracts that said, "I promise to deliver this specific tulip bulb next spring, and you promise to pay me X amount when I do." The Dutch had a name for this kind of trading. They called it the windhandel, the wind trade, because you were literally buying and selling wind. Nothing changed hands. No actual flower moved, just promises, paper, expectations. And because interest rates in the Netherlands had dropped sharply, these contracts required basically zero upfront collateral. You could buy a futures contract on a bulb you'd never seen using money you didn't have yet, planning to sell it to someone else before you ever had to pay. A single bulb contract could change hands 10 times in a single day. People weren't buying tulips. They were buying the right to sell tulips to someone else who would sell them to someone else. Everyone was assuming the next person would pay more. Sound familiar? And where did all this trading happen? Not on the official stock exchange. That was for serious commodities. Grain, spices, VOC shares. Tulips were traded in taverns. In Haarlem, which became the absolute center of the trade, over 40 taverns were running active tulip markets by 1637. Groups of merchants, called colleges, gathered in local inns to negotiate contracts over drinks. Prominent spots included a place called the Swan Inn, the Golden Fleece, and the De Waag, the Weigh House, where bulbs were assessed on tiny scales down to a microscopic unit of weight called the parrot, smaller than a grain of sand. In Amsterdam, one of the most famous trading hubs was a place called the Minste Bruiloft, the Mennonite wedding. It was known not just for tulip trades, but for its cabinet of curiosities and elaborate water features that powered mechanical automatons mimicking the sound of birdsong. That was the backdrop for some of the most expensive flower deals in history. Mechanical singing birds and a room full of drunk speculators trading air. The bidding process had a name, in het ootje, which roughly translates to pull someone's leg. Whether you accepted a bid or refused it, the seller still had to pay a small commission. That commission, called wine money, was immediately spent buying rounds for the entire table. You couldn't leave without either making a deal or buying everyone drinks. The entire market was literally lubricated by alcohol and peer pressure. By the way, if you're enjoying this kind of history, where the real story turns out to be far stranger than the textbook version, this channel does a lot of that. Hit subscribe if you want more. It genuinely helps. Okay, back to the taverns. By the winter of 1636 to 1637, something had shifted. The mania wasn't just among wealthy collectors anymore. Artisans, weavers, bakers, carpenters, ordinary working people started flooding into the tavern markets, lured by stories of overnight fortunes. And with that flood of new, inexperienced money, prices went completely vertical. Here's some context. A skilled craftsman in the 1630s earned about 300 guilders a year. At the peak, a common tulip bulb was fetching several hundred guilders. The Admiral van der Eyck sold for 1,260 guilders. The Viceroy, one of the most sought-after broken varieties, went for between 3,000 and 4,200 guilders. And at the very top of the hierarchy sat the Semper Augustus. The Semper Augustus was, without question, the most expensive tulip in history. Blood-red flames on a milky white base, breathtakingly symmetrical, and vanishingly rare. At its peak, there were only about a dozen bulbs in the entire country, all owned by one man. His name was Adrian Pauw, director of the Dutch East India Company, one of the most powerful politicians in the Netherlands. He cultivated his dozen Semper Augustus bulbs at his private estate, and he refused to sell a single one. But here's what he did do. He built a wooden cabinet lined with mirrors around the flower bed. So when you visited his garden and peered inside, you saw what appeared to be an infinite, endlessly reflecting field of the world's most expensive flower. Rows and rows of Semper Augustus, stretching on forever. It was a parlor trick, an illusion, but it was a perfect physical metaphor for the entire market. The appearance of endless abundance, built entirely on reflection. At peak prices, a single Semper Augustus bulb sold for 10,000 guilders, enough to purchase one of the finest canal mansions in Amsterdam, outright, with a coach house and a garden, for one bulb. Because hard cash was scarce, people often traded other things for bulbs entirely. There's a famous list recorded from 1636 detailing everything exchanged for a single viceroy. 2 cartloads of wheat, 4 cartloads of rye, 4 fat oxen, 8 fat pigs, 12 sheep, 2 barrels of wine, 4 barrels of beer, 2 tons of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed with furnishings, a suit of clothes, and a silver drinking cup. Total value? About 2,500 guilders. For one tulip bulb, still in the ground. Now, this era also gave us some of the most famous, and almost certainly completely made up, stories in financial history. The most famous one is The Sailor and the Onion. According to the legend, a wealthy Amsterdam merchant rewarded a visiting sailor for delivering good news of a shipment, gave him a fine red herring as payment. The sailor, wandering back through the merchant's counting house, spotted what he assumed was a stray onion sitting on the counter. He pocketed it, went back to his ship, and ate it alongside his herring for lunch. The merchant discovered his bulb was missing. He tracked the sailor down in a panic, found him finishing the last bite of a Semper Augustus worth around 3,000 guilders, enough to feed the entire ship's crew for a year. The sailor was allegedly arrested and imprisoned on felony charges for eating lunch. There's a similar story about an English botanist visiting a wealthy Dutchman's conservatory. He spots what he thinks is an interesting specimen, takes out his penknife, and starts methodically dissecting it, peeling it layer by layer, cutting it in half, carefully examining the structure inside, completely absorbed in the science. The horrified Dutch owner watches the whole thing in silence as the botanist calmly destroys a small fortune, one careful slice at a time. Great stories, almost definitely not true. Historians have found versions of the mistaken for an onion story going back to 1570, decades before the mania even happened. These were recycled moral parables, deliberately designed to make one specific point. How absurd is it that something completely indistinguishable from an onion could be worth a man's life savings? The story didn't need to be true to be effective. It just needed to be funny and a little bit horrifying. The crash, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. On February 3rd, 1637, at a routine tavern auction in Haarlem, a seller put up a parcel of bulbs. No one bid. The seller lowered the price. Still nothing. The room went quiet. And in that silence, the entire market died. Word spread through the tavern networks almost instantly. Within days, buyers had completely evaporated. People holding contracts worth thousands of guilders just 1 week earlier were now trying to offload them at 1% of their value. There were no takers. February 1637 was also the moment the bulbs were beginning to sprout. Green shoots were appearing above the frost. Spring was coming. The window of trading dormant, invisible, purely theoretical bulbs was closing, and suddenly the cold reality of actual supply and demand was reasserting itself. The spell broke. The legal aftermath was a mess. Sellers demanded payment on contracts. Buyers refused. The case went all the way to the Court of Holland, who looked at this enormous pile of speculative debt and essentially said, "We don't want to touch this." A ruling eventually came. Because the Windhandel contracts involved no collateral and no physical assets at the time of signing, they were legally classified as gambling debts, and under Dutch law, gambling debts were unenforceable in court. Most contracts were simply never honored. Buyers walked away paying maybe 3.5%, if anything at all. The growers were left holding their physical bulbs, bearing almost the entire loss themselves. The architecture of promises collapsed, and nobody went to prison. Nobody threw themselves into a canal. The legal system just shrugged. For nearly 400 years, Tulip Mania has been told as this apocalyptic story of mass societal madness. Entire books written about it. Economics professors still use it. It's the go-to metaphor whenever someone wants to say an asset is overpriced. The version most people know comes from a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay, who wrote about it in 1841. 200 years after it happened, in a book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. According to Mackay, the entire country lost its mind. Even chimney sweeps were gambling their life savings on flowers. People were ruined en masse. Total chaos. There's just one problem. In 2007, a historian named Anne Goldgar went through the actual Dutch archives, municipal records, court cases, bankruptcy filings, all of it. She could not find a single person who went bankrupt solely because of tulip speculation. Not one. The broader Dutch economy, powered by the enormous wealth of the VOC and global trade, barely noticed the crash. The Windhandel was confined to a relatively small, interconnected network of middle-class merchants and collectors, not the entire nation. So where did the myth of mass ruin come from? Calvinists. Specifically, moralizing pamphlets written by Calvinist preachers horrified that people were getting rich off flowers instead of honest labor. The most famous featured two characters in allegorical dialogue: Vermont, meaning true mouth, representing traditional morality, and Gergot, meaning greedy goods, representing the seduction of the market. At one point, Gergot tries to recruit his friend into the Windhandel, boasting, "You can make cent for cent, 10 for 1, 100 for 1, sometimes 1,000. These weren't journalism. They were sermons dressed as conversation. Mackay treated them as factual reporting. Historians after him repeated his mistakes. And so the myth of total economic catastrophe crystallized into accepted history, repeated in textbooks for nearly 2 centuries. The visual arts of the era joined the moral panic too, and produced one of the most remarkable pieces of satirical art in history. Jan Bruegel the Younger painted a piece in 1640 called Satire on Tulip Mania. In it, the traders aren't depicted as men, they're monkeys. Monkeys in fine, aristocratic 17th century clothing, lace collars, velvet coats, feathered hats, eagerly weighing bulbs on tiny scales, hoarding money bags, sitting at lavish business dinners. An owl perches on the shoulder of one monkey who is drafting a bill of sale. In this context, the owl isn't a symbol of wisdom. It's a symbol of blindness, of stupidity. You only think you're wise. And in the background of the painting, the crash has already happened. One monkey urinates on the now worthless flowers. Another stands weeping in the dock before a judge. The entire arc of the bubble, Greed, collapse, judgment, captured in one image, with monkeys. Meanwhile, serious artists treated the tulip itself with complete reverence. Rembrandt von Rijn painted his wife Saskia as Flora, the Roman goddess of spring, in 1634. And crowning her floral headdress, featured prominently, is a massive, resplendent, broken tulip. In the middle of the financial circus, the flower itself was still being treated as something divine. The romanticization of the era lasted well into the next century. In 1850, Alexander Dumas wrote The Black Tulip, a novel set against the backdrop of the Dutch tulip craze, centered on a prize of 100,000 florins offered to anyone who could breed a perfectly black tulip. It involves jealousy, betrayal, imprisonment, stolen credit, and attempted murder. A thriller about a flower breeding competition, set 400 years ago. And Dumas made it work. The legend of the tulip had completely outgrown the actual event. So if Tulip Mania wasn't actually that devastating, why do we keep talking about it? Because the psychology was real, even if the scale was exaggerated. You had a market that decoupled entirely from intrinsic value. Novice speculators flooding in, chasing stories of overnight wealth. Trading in promises rather than physical assets, with no collateral, no oversight, fueled by social pressure and the fear of missing out. You had the greater fool theory in full effect, the belief that it doesn't matter what you pay for something, as long as someone else will pay more tomorrow. We've seen this same pattern repeat since. The dot-com bubble, the housing crisis in 2008, meme stocks, crypto, NFTs. And honestly, NFTs are probably the closest modern parallel to the broken tulip. Think about it: unique, non-reproducible, visually distinctive assets deriving their entire value from community hype and artificial scarcity, rather than any underlying utility. The Semper Augustus was essentially a very exclusive piece of visual art, existing in only a handful of copies. What I find genuinely fascinating about Tulip Mania isn't the prices or the crash or even the myth. It's that for a brief moment in history, a virus-infected flower bulb became one of the most contested, most desired, most culturally loaded objects in the world. Artists painted it as a symbol of both beauty and madness. Rembrandt crowned his wife with one like a goddess. Satirists drew monkeys in suits trading it in taverns. Calvinist preachers raged about it from pulpits. Novelists wrote thrillers about it 2 centuries later. A flower carried all of that weight. And maybe that's the real lesson. Markets aren't just about money. They're about what a society decides to believe in, together, at a specific moment in time. And when that belief evaporates, it evaporates fast. Whether you're trading in pathogen-streaked flower bulbs in a smoke-filled Harlem tavern or speculating on digital tokens across global networks, the human psychology underneath it all is remarkably consistent. The ghost of the Semper Augustus is still out there. If you made it all the way here, genuinely, thank you. These videos take a serious amount of research, and I hope that came through. If you want to support the channel, the easiest thing you can do is hit like and subscribe. It tells the algorithm this is worth showing to more people, and it makes a real difference. I'll see you in the next one.